Amongst history's swordsmen, one of the most iconic examples is the Highlander with his basket-hilted broadsword and his targe. And while the basket hilt is often associated with the Scots, in fact the English examples are the earliest dated ones, and we also find examples from Ireland as well. So it's really a thing that we find all over the British Isles. And in previous videos I have looked at what peculiar social conditions or military strategy was involved in making the basket hilt so popular in England, Scotland and Ireland. And why was that? But weirdly, in doing some family history research, it's given me another idea why perhaps basket hilts were so popular in the British Isles. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So we've looked at the pros and cons, the advantages and disadvantages of basket hilts in the past. There are actually many, but the headline ones I think that's important if you haven't seen those previous videos to note is that obviously they offer just about the most hand protection of any type of sword that's ever existed in human history. They're incredibly protective, but that does come at a cost, and one of the main costs is weight and also inconvenience of wearing. They can kind of get in the way. They can be a little bit slow to get your hand into, depending on the angle of the sword. So if you need to quick draw, for example, you don't really want complex hilts. But once your hand's in it, supreme hand protection. It's just that that comes at the cost of weight and wearing inconvenience. But there is another one which we often mention as well, and that is, and the Victorian writers who are used to using sabres like to point this out, there is they refer to it as less play of the wrist. So what we find is that there are certain grips and movements of the hand which are more difficult in a more confined basket hilt. But that being said, they offer a vast amount of hand protection. And rather than the more developed 17th and 18th century styles that you associate with the Scottish Highlanders particularly, these earlier style of basket hilts, and this is one of the prototypes actually from the Royal Armouries line that I'm working on with Windlass, so this isn't the final version, but that is coming soon, and we've now signed that off. This is based on an example which came out of the River Thames in London, and in fact there are others that came out of the River Thames, but moreover there are other examples of these from England, and this type of hilt is first documented, not to say it necessarily came from England because we don't really know, but it's first documented in England in English examples found archaeologically from about the 1520s, 1530s, so really quite early. You often think of basket hilts as a 17th, 18th century style sword, but these were already around really only 40 years after the end of the Wars of the Roses. It's incredible. So one of the great questions is why? Why did the English and the Scottish and the Irish, the people of the British Isles in general, go so quickly? Why did they run so quickly towards these basket hilts? And I've often pondered this, and I've pondered this in video form before, but I've come across a new way of thinking about this, a new angle, which I think might be worth considering. And this focuses on two particular aspects of swordsmanship. One is that in the British Isles, both in England and Scotland most, at least historically notably, bucklers and later targes, used by the Scots of course, were very prominently used with these swords. So yes, while these swords could be used by themselves, in not too different to later sabre methods, which in some cases are derived from earlier broadsword method. But certainly in the 16th century, when these appear, it was pretty much universal, or at least very, very common, shall we say. Let's hedge our bets. Very, very common, and even notable in historical sources, we'll get to that in a second, that bucklers were still being used in England, okay? We'll get to Scotland in a second. But the buckler, while it was used all over Europe and had been used obviously throughout the Middle Ages since the 13th century, probably deriving from earlier boss-gripped shields used before that. But the buckler, yes, it was used all over Europe. But interestingly, by the 16th century, most countries were moving away from the buckler. Not necessarily all of them, and the buckler is still around in fencing treatises of the 16th century. Most famously in Italy, incidentally, and it's weird because there's a lot of military parallels between the Italians and the English for unknown reasons. For example, they like using bills instead of halberds. Well, the English also liked using bills, and the buckler stayed popular at least for the first half of the 1500s in Italy, and it was still very popular in England. But here's a notable thing. It is notable that by about the 1570s, 1580s, in most of Europe, most people had switched to using a dagger in their left hand. This process had already started in the earlier 1500s. If we look at Achille Marotz's treatise of 1536, he deals with the buckler primarily, but he does introduce the sword and dagger, so it's already starting to be a thing. We don't really see it as a thing in the 15th century, Dura aside. But by the time we get to the 1530s, 1540s, we start to see the buckler gradually starting to be supplanted by the dagger. So that by the middle of the 1500s in most of continental Europe, the sword, or side sword as we call it these days, the sort of not quite a rapier yet, or early form of rapier at least, somewhere between an arming sword and a rapier, is usually partnered with the dagger. And this was notable that in England, however, when people came to England, they pointed out that the English were still using the buckler. So much so that in coroner's records and things like this from the 1580s in London, we actually find some people using sword and dagger and some people using sword and buckler, and there are sources which refer to the sword and buckler as being the more traditional English form and still being used by traditional English swordsmen, as even described in George Silver's work. Now, adding to that, there was also a love in England of using the cut more than the thrust. So gradually over time in Italy, for example, there was a gradual preference for more pointy and gradually longer blades and more use of the point. We can start to see this already in Agrippa in the middle of the 1500s. But generally speaking, while they're still cut and thrusting, it is notable that the English seem to have a dislike of using the point very much. And they're, you know, if we look at George Silver's works, he's constantly talking about the disadvantages of using thrust-centric swords, rapiers as he would call them, over the old cut and thrust broadswords and backswords. So we've got various bits of data to work with here, but it's absolutely notable, and I would say unquestionable, that the basket-hilted sword and the buckler were the traditional and preferred weapon set for most of the 16th century in England. Now obviously in Scotland they had the buckler as well, but there is an emerging weapon which already has its earliest references as early as 1470, although we don't necessarily know from the written text exactly what type of shield or buckler they're describing. But already by the 1500s we're starting to get the emergence of circular and flat-ish round shields like this. And incidentally, there's a famous type of buckler from Wales as well, known as a Welsh buckler. Maybe we'll look at those in a future video. But the targe is a particularly famous, and this is an original sort of Culloden era one, the targe is a particularly famous and notable characteristic of Scottish, particularly Highland swordsmen, and of course that was partnered with their own designs of basket hilt, which probably originally were pretty much similar, or at least derived from or related to the English forms, although ironically the English sometimes referred to it as an Irish hilt, just to confuse matters further. But with time, and in the 16th century, they start to develop their own characteristic styles of Scottish basket hilt. But the notable feature here is both the English and the Scottish and the Irish are using basket hilted swords with forms of small shield. Now, we can talk about all the advantages of protection that the hilt gives, but we've already done that in the past. But there's a couple of things that I have noticed that happen when you're using a basket hilt with a buckler. Now, one of those is the two things can clash together. Okay, so if you're used to using a side sword, for example, let's just grab one off the wall here. One of the nice things about using a side sword and a buckler is you can get the hands very close together. This would be the same with a traditional medieval arming sword and buckler. When you're used to putting the hands very close to each other, if you then pick up a basket hilt, it can be quite awkward to begin with because you instantly find that the two things can't get that close together quite a lot of the time because of the size of the basket hilt. But of course, if you regard that as a minus point or a disadvantage, I don't know if it really is at all, the massive advantage is your hand is basically invulnerable to most attacks. So these two things can be out in front, and it's essentially like you've got two bucklers, because you've got a buckler on this side and a buckler on this side. And you might just think it only protects the hand, but it doesn't. It protects more than that, because due to, just use an arrow, which is sitting here, due to geometry, it's a bit fumbling around here, there we go. Due to geometry, if you've got a larger hilt, it means things coming over here can't easily get to your sword arm either. So the bigger your hilt is, and we certainly experienced this with forms of rapier hilt as well, it's why some of the bars are quite far away from the hand. Due to geometry and angulation, it means that the opponent's weapon can't really get to your sword arm either. So basket hilts actually provide a huge amount of protection even to the head as well, because they project higher up. So to the head, the sword arm, the shoulder, this side, and if you're guarding on this side, you don't need to move the sword quite so far because the basket hilt itself provides quite a lot of protection. What you've essentially done is, as I say, you've added another buckler to the other side. But here's the thing I've noticed. If you are using a fairly open hilted sword like this, with no hand protection, which you wouldn't be certainly in civilian life, or if you're something like an archer, longbowman, or halberdier or whatever that isn't wearing gauntlets, your hand is fundamentally vulnerable. Now, we often think about the vulnerability to cuts and thrusts from the opponent's weapon, but this is also a threat. Now, what actually hammered this into my mind was me hammering my own hand with my buckler. So I was fencing about a month ago, sword and buckler, and I went to block someone's incoming blow, and I did, but at the same time, I ploughed the edge of my buckler into my probably too thin for what I was doing gloves. Now, a lot of people doing HEMA wouldn't necessarily notice this because most people wearing HEMA when they're sparring are wearing very protective gloves, which are designed to protect from sword hits. So you just bashing a buckler into your fingers, you're not going to really notice it most of the time, especially if you've got, you know, a really protective glove. However, if you're not wearing a really protective glove, or you've just got bare hands, as a lot of the people actually using these things in real life would have been, smashing the edge of a buckler into your own fingers is pretty much akin to getting smacked in the fingers by an opposing blunt sword. It's really horrible, really painful. It was honestly one of the most painful hits I've had in sparring for months or years, and it was inflicted by my own buckler. I'm not an expert sword and buckler fencer at all, so I blame myself for that. Anyway, so this wouldn't have happened, obviously, if I'd had a basket hilt, because the hand is completely protected, not only from opposing swords, but also from my buckler, and also from the opponent's buckler. Okay, and that's something that often gets overlooked, is that in a situation or a culture, just very carefully picking up the original here, where targes are very common or bucklers are very common, bear in mind these have edges on them, but some of them have spikes on the front. Certainly lots of targes do, and even some bucklers have projections or spikes on the front. So the hand's actually very, very vulnerable. So possibly, this is just a theory, possibly in a culture which is so fixated on using a sword and buckler or sword and targe, not only is the hand at risk from the opposing sword, but it's at risk from the opposing or your own buckler as well. So maybe these two things really go together like bread and butter. But building on that, another piece of the jigsaw fell into place for me for this new theory. And let me know down below, do you think is this a workable theory? Am I onto something here, or I'm just completely gone off the rails? I don't know. Here's the thing. If you are in a culture, as I say, where you're used to using a basket hilt and a dagger, one thing that you're not particularly well suited to doing is fighting in close. What do I mean by that? So let's just pick up a longsword for a second to consider this point. So usually when we're looking at longsword fencing, we're looking at obviously use of the point in various ways, cutting with the back edge or the front edge from different angles and in different ways. However, if a person manages to block your sword or charge in or whatever, then there's a whole bunch of techniques which involve coming in with the pommel, occasionally coming into half sword, which is what we predominantly do in armoured fighting. But that's reliant on the fact that I've got two hands, and usually two hands are on the back end of the weapon, okay, but sometimes I'll bring that left hand up to here. Equally, I could cover and I could do a wrap, I could do a grab and all of these sorts of things. So fundamentally, I've got a sword in one hand, which could be used two-handed, either with both hands at the back or one hand in the middle. and I have a left hand which I can use as well. So I've got a whole plethora of close-in grappling gioco stretto techniques that I can use. But when I've got a basket hilt and a buckler, I can wrap, and this is shown in 133, wrapping with the buckler arm, but I'm kind of impeded because I'm holding two things. So what's the obvious thing if someone comes in close, if I've parried and they just charge in? What's the obvious thing? Well, yes, I could knee, I could kick, potentially even headbutt, but by and large, I've got two iron-covered fists. So obviously I can strike with the buckler either front way on if I've got some kind of spike, or with the edge, probably more effective if I don't have a spike on the front. And with the sword, the exact same thing. The basket hilt becomes an incredibly effective striking implement. So very brief tangent for a second. So this is where family history research came into it. And this is something that made me think about this. So we know that striking with the hilt is something that we absolutely find in backsword, broadsword sources, okay? Perhaps most famously in the modern HEMA world, George Silver has a load of grips and closes, a bunch of techniques, which I myself have demonstrated because it's also done in sabre, particularly from Alfred Hutton's works on how to fight an uncivilized enemy. Him and Cyril Matthey, his best friend, went and studied the works of George Silver to incorporate grips and closes and strikes with the hilt and in other ways, grabs and so on, into the military sabre kind of techniques and system that he was hoping for the British Army to adopt. He published these in 1897 in The Swordsman, and I've demonstrated it as you can see here. But these techniques originally come from Elizabethan swordplay, which he regarded as fighting rather than fencing, and he makes a whole argument for how army swordsmanship should be more fighting and less fencing. But anyway, that's for another video, although you can see my previous video on that. So this is an interesting case. I was doing some family history research, and now I'm part Scottish, approximately a quarter, and I was going back through the Scottish line, and I've got quite far back. I've got back to someone who lived in the late 1500s and through to the middle of the 1600s. He was my 11th great-grandfather, and his name was William Reed of Borough, okay, from near Aberdeen. Anyway, there was a legal case. In 1607, a quarrel arose between William Reed and his brother Andrew on one part, and someone else called Bissett on the other side. Now, there are two versions of this story. I'm going to tell you Bissett's version because it's particularly pertinent to this video. So, Bissett complained to the Privy Council that the Reeds had by all indirect means this long time procured his hurt. Thus, on 2nd of May 1607, a day appointed for the service of God and proclaim it fast, while the complainer was going to the kirk in Aberdeen, in a most quiet and pressiable manner, without any kind of armour. So he was Bissett was not armoured or protected, armed at all. The said Andrew Reed, at the instigation of his said brother, waylaid him in a quiet venel. This is written in phonetic Scottish from the 16th century or early 17th century. It's quite difficult for me to read. Venel Cahilk Guis fra the said complaineris house to the kirk, and with gantilat, which is gauntlets, plaint slave, which is plate slave, which is armour on the arms, sword, dagger, and Highland dirk, which is a Highland dirk, which I've got one of here, okay, so fully armed, set upon him, and with the guards of his sword, ta-da, there's the guards of his sword, with the guards of his sword, gave him many deadly strikes in his head, shoulders, and small of his back, and left him for deed. It is literally, that's not me doing a bad Scottish accent, that's literally how it's written. To understand some of this 1607 text, you have to read it in what sounds like a bad Scottish accent to work out what words they're saying. So in other words, the brother of my 11th great-grandfather set about someone, beat him up with the hilt, with the guard of his sword. There we go. And as I say, this is absolutely something we find in, you know, George Silver, but a whole bunch of other broadsword and backsword treatises of the 17th and 18th centuries. So I feel like all of this data kind of is leading us somewhere. I think that the use of basket hilts is potentially tied to the fact that the English kept using bucklers for really quite a long time, and the Scots kept using targes all the way through into the middle of the 18th century, until the Battle of Culloden and the Highland clearances, really. And I can't help thinking that the fact that basket hilts were so popular is somehow related to these. Somehow the way they work together, obviously the added protection of the hand, but additionally the fact that it protects you from both your buckler and the opponent's bucklers, and the fact that when you come to close in, when you've got a sword and buckler in rough fighting, it's very difficult for you to drop one of these and go for a dagger, or indeed to grab someone, because you can't very easily grab someone if you've got a buckler or a targe in your other hand. And of course, compared to rapier and dagger, or side sword and dagger, well, the dagger is more offensive than the buckler is, but not as defensive. So punching with the hilt of the sword perhaps proportionately becomes more important in a culture where you're using targes and bucklers as well. What do you think? Do you think I'm onto something? I haven't, as you can tell, I haven't fully kind of formed how these things are related, but I feel like they must be. I feel like there's too many coincidences here. The fact that bucklers and targes were so popular in England and Scotland and Ireland, it has to be said, and Wales, it has to be said, and the fact that they loved basket hilts. What do you think? Do you think I'm onto something? And it's great to find a bit of family history that connects to swordsmanship. It's almost the first example I've ever found in family history research which actually involves using a sword related to my own ancestors. So anyway, I'm quite, you know, obviously there's general accounts of them being at a certain battle and stuff, but that's the first time I found a first-hand account of what was actually done. In this case, perhaps not legally, although I have to say there's another side of the story which maybe we'll look at in a future video. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. What do you think? Post down below, share your thoughts, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.